Hey, folks, thanks for tuning in again to the Peaceful Way podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be continuing my series on the intelligence anti-community, where we are covering all of the alphabet agencies and the nefarious stuff they've been up to. In any case, if this is your first introduction to this series, you don't have to listen to every episode of it, but I would recommend listening to the prologue first, getting an idea of what we're doing, and then jumping into the episode if you haven't heard the prologue yet. Otherwise, each chapter can sort of stand on its own. But anyways, if you like this episode, please go ahead, rate and review the show. Share it with people who you think might like it. That would be much appreciated on Spotify or on YouTube. You can also subscribe, and that helps get into more ears. Anyways, this is Chapter 2, The All-Seeing Eye. Peace. In Christian theology, God is omniscient, all-knowing and all-seeing. He knows the beginning and the end. He knows and sees every action and thought of every person who has ever lived since the dawn of time. He is aware of the movement of every blade of grass. He has accounted for the death and birth of every creature, large and small. Nothing is hidden from him. He sees and has counted all the stars that have gone supernova, all the galaxies that have collided, and every small meteor that has burned up in the atmosphere of a celestial body. There is no place man can hide from his sight, and no thought he can obscure from his hearing. In the 11th chapter of Psalms, verse 4, the author writes, "The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of man." And again later in the 33rd chapter of Psalms, "Behold, the eyes of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love." And finally, in the 34th chapter, the motif appears again. "The eyes of the Lord are towards the righteous, and his ears towards their cry." During the Renaissance period, artistic renderings of what would come to be known as the Eye of Providence began to appear in Christian art. Though its exact origins are unclear, the most common depiction of the design was a triangle representing the Christian Trinity, with the human eye situated in the center of the triangle, symbolizing God's sovereignty and providence over the whole of mankind. We see it floating above Jesus' head in Pontormo's famous painting, The Supper at Emmaus. In Le Barbier's artistic rendition of France's Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Eye of Providence sits above the text to indicate that God himself is enforcing the document. And perhaps most famously, the eye is seen on the US $1 bill, atop a 13-step pyramid representing the 13 original states. And here again, the eye is meant to signify that God is watching over the nation like a parental figure. By the early 1700s, the all-seeing eye was also appearing in all sorts of Freemason imagery, from gravestones to stamps. Even the infamous Bavarian Illuminati, an offshoot of the Freemasons, employ the use of the symbol in their official writings. By the 1770s and well into the 19th century, references to the Eye of Providence were scattered throughout Mason literature. In fact, it strangely became an important focal point, with many leaders in the organization stressing their lodges to take heed. William Preston, a prominent Scottish Freemason, said in his book entitled Illustrations on Masonry, quote, "Although our thoughts, words, and actions may be hidden from the eyes of man, yet that all-seeing eye, whom the sun, moon, and stars obey, and under whose watchful care even comets perform their stupendous revolutions, pervades the inmost recesses of the human heart, and will reward us according to our merits." End quote. It may sound strange to us in the modern era, but throughout the 18th and 19th and even early 20th century, the Eye of Providence was seen as a symbol of benevolence, signifying a deity who watches over and cares for his children. It was a way to analogize the idea that God sees the good works of men and will reward them, and at the same time sees the evil works of men and will punish accordingly. To this day, Freemasons will still very publicly defend the symbol, claiming that the modern negative connotations associated with it is simply a misunderstanding, and that pop culture has bastardized it through movies and books, like in George Orwell's 1984, with that famous line, quote, "Big Brother is always watching," end quote, and his face appears on every television screen with a dark glare, watching your every move. The watchful eye suffered yet another PR defeat with the publication of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where it depicts the flaming eye of Sauron on top of the tower, Barad-dûr, searching and watching all across Middle-earth for the One Ring, and woe to those who capture its gaze. Now, as much as I hate casually going along with mainstream opinions, I'm going to have to part ways with the Freemasons on this one. Language, ideas, and symbols are not always static. They evolve with time, and certain dramatic events will change the meaning. And the Eye of Providence is no exception. Take, for example, the word fascism. If anyone in the post-World War II era publicly self-identifies as a fascist, they will be ostracized in polite society. They can lose jobs, be denied entrance into post-secondary institutions, and even get debanked. Fascism is such a radioactive word today that the mere accusation of being a fascist, without any evidence, can make you subject to social ridicule, online harassment, doxing, and even, rarely, physical harm. But this wasn't always the case. In the 1920s and 30s, fascism was very in vogue, and not just in Europe. The Anglo world, from Britain to the United States and Australia, all had fascist leagues of their own. There were even fascists elected to public office in these countries. The black nationalist Marcus Garvey, who to this day is looked up to with almost universal admiration by black rappers, athletes, politicians, and activists, was an avowed fascist. I'm not just being hyperbolic, he called himself a fascist and sung the praises of Hitler on numerous occasions. My point here, though, isn't to adjudicate the true meaning of the word fascism, only to point out that the perception of the idea and the word was very different 100 years ago than today because of the vicious mass murder campaign carried out by Hitler and Goebbels against the Jews of Europe. Fascism today means something quantitatively different than it did at the turn of the century. But that gradual change of definition wasn't undeserved. The Nazis certainly earned its reputation. I could go on with example after example of how terms change with their meaning, but I think you get the point, and this is no less true with the Eye of Providence. It too began to lose favor with the public, and that was primarily thanks to the work of one man by the name of Jeremy Bentham. The Greek words pan, meaning all, and optikos, meaning sight, combined to make a word that has entered the modern lexicon and makes us all shudder: the panopticon. Based on the etymology of the word, the idea is almost self-explanatory. Like a god, those who have the panopticon have the power to see and hear everything. Clearly, this is what Bentham had in mind when he first conceptualized the idea with his brother Samuel. In letters and correspondence he had with colleagues, he said as much. My guess would be that he was familiar with the notion, in both Freemasonry and Christianity, that when one believed God was watching everything they did, they would behave differently, more honorably, and for the common good. But because Bentham himself was an atheist and scoffed at the idea of a deity, or any supernatural claims for that matter, he would need to replace the God in the equation with man, naturally. I should note he was a legal scholar and considered to be the founder of modern utilitarianism, the belief that, quote, society should be ordered in such a way as to provide the most amount of good for the most amount of people, end quote, a phrase he is credited with coining. In the moral calculations of utilitarians, well, at least consistent utilitarians, the ends justifies the means. Even atrocities are hypothetically permissible if the consequences are that more people are saved on the whole. And this was Bentham's belief to a T, which is why he conjured up the whole panopticon scheme, because he thought that if everyone believed they were always being observed, there would be far less crime, drunkenness, murder, domestic abuse, theft, and all manner of social ills. If there was a way to convince the whole of society that someone was watching them at all times, the vast majority of these problems would be mostly solved. This is all the ideological framing of the idea, which will be important as we delve further into our topic. But the practical side of the panopticon was a prison building that Bentham had designed, which he believed, if successfully implemented, could be extrapolated out to the entire society. The structure itself would be large and circular, several stories high, with exposed prison cells lined along the walls. Then there would be a courtyard on the inside walls, where prisoners would spend the majority of their day. In the courtyard, all of the amenities necessary would be present, like a dining hall, gym, and washing facilities. Finally, in the center of the courtyard would be a tall tower in which outsider observers would be unable to view its interior. Inside of the tower could be hundreds of guards, or as few as one. The whole idea was to make the entire facility visible to the tower, and as a result, it would be a foreboding symbol to each inmate that he is being observed at all times. He does not know by whom or by how many, but he does know that should he violate any of the rules, he would risk reprisals and can never be certain that someone can't see him. In his own words, this is how he described it in his writings in the inspection house. Quote, "The building circular, and iron caged, glazed, a glass lantern about the size of a ranelagh, the prisoners in their cells, occupying the circumference, the officers the center. By blinds and other contrivances, the inspectors concealed from the observation of the prisoners. Hence, the sentiment of a sort of invisible omnipresence. The whole circuit, reviewable with little, or if necessary, without any change of place." End quote. It would only take one or two punishments from guards in the eye of the prison to demonstrate that no one could hide. It would subsequently set a paranoia out among the inmates, which would, in effect, regulate their behavior better than 1,000 guards ever could in a typical prison. In many ways, it's ingenious, because you could hypothetically staff an entire prison with a single guard. It would be incredibly efficient. Now, a basic rule of human psychology is that we behave differently when we know we are being watched. When you or I are in very public settings, we act a little differently than we would when we're home. It's not that you have a completely different identity, it's just that you let your hair down a little, so to speak. You don't make much of an effort to look presentable. Perhaps you slouch when you're sitting, or blast loud music or sing to yourself. In fact, its effects are subtle and even subconscious, the condition of being watched, that is. Even in completely innocent environments, it changes our moods, thought patterns, and even brain chemistry. And all of that is completely natural. In Bentham's worldview, this was exactly the desired effect that would bring about something of a utopia. When we feel peer pressure all the time, it tilts us towards a particular type of pro-social behavior. All of a sudden, we would need vastly fewer resources committed to law enforcement efforts. People would be more charitable, less rude, and be more willing to abandon their addictions. All of which would put far less strain on the society as a whole, as workers would be more productive and antisocial behavior would be less costly, creating a large economic and happiness surplus among the populace. Or so the thinking goes. The logic of the panopticon might make sense in one's head. But like all novel innovations that come into the minds of eccentric social theorists, the question always is, who watches the watchers? Who is sufficiently noble and altruistic enough to only use their powers of omniscience for moral ends? Who could not be corrupted by such a power? Who wouldn't use it to tip the scales in their favor at the cost of others? It's a system begging to be abused and exploited. It's not like the Christian conceptualization of an all-seeing God, which seems so much more workable because this God is a morally perfect being who transcends mankind in every conceivable way. What makes men like Jeremy Bentham so dangerous is they see themselves as God. They believe it is themselves who wield the sword of divine justice. It is them who must sovereignly adjudicate over the whole of society. They have deified themselves to be meticulous planners and infallible micromanagers. One can't help but wonder at Bentham's own atheism, in that it wasn't that he cared one way or another about the supernatural claims of religion, but that the idea of an entity who challenged his own hysterically inflated view of himself was something he simply could not tolerate. His unhinged, neurotic pathology did not simply disbelieve in a god, but the whole concept of an ultimate being deeply offended him. Bentham shopped his ideas to colleagues around the United Kingdom and even to mainland Europe. He had the ear of a number of British parliamentarians who were keen to implement it. He even advertised it as a multi-use design, which could be applied to hospitals, universities, and factories. Throughout the 1800s, a few panopticons were built, in both the UK and Europe, and in the Americas as well. But ultimately, the idea never really caught on. Many of those that were built didn't even last into the 20th century and were either decommissioned or sold off. Even the site that Bentham purchased to build his ideal panopticon in Tate, Britain, was eventually turned into an art gallery. In many of his correspondence in his later life, he would often complain that the British aristocracy and European intelligentsia weren't taking his ideas seriously enough. Utilitarianism, the philosophy he popularized, and which became what he was immortalized for, didn't seem to matter to him all that much. He was far more heartbroken that his quirky prison idea never caught on. However, Bentham will get the last laugh. He may have been born far too early to ever realize his dreams come to full fruition, but his ideas would come back with a vengeance. In only a couple of centuries, and with the dawn of the internet, the panopticon would not be made of brick and mortar, but of digital networks, microprocessors, and software.
My name's Ed Snowden. I'm 29 years old. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA in Hawaii.
What are some of the positions that you held previously within the intelligence community?
I've been a systems engineer, systems administrator, senior advisor for the Central Intelligence Agency, solutions consultant, and a telecommunications information systems officer.
One of the things people are going to be most interested in trying to understand who you are and what you're thinking is there came some point in time when you crossed this line of thinking about being a whistleblower to making the choice to actually become a whistleblower. Walk people through that decision-making process.
When you're in positions of privileged access, like a systems administrator for these sort of intelligence community agencies, you're exposed to a lot more information on a broader scale than the average employee. And because of that, you see things that may be disturbing, but over the course of a normal person's career, you'd only see one or two of these instances. When you see everything, you see them on a more frequent basis. And you recognize that some of these things are actually abuses. And when you talk to people about them, in a place like this where this is the normal state of business, people tend not to take them very seriously and move on from them. But over time, that awareness of wrongdoing sort of builds up, and you feel compelled to talk about it. And the more you talk about it, the more you're ignored, the more you're told it's not a problem. Until eventually you realize that these things need to be determined by the public, not by somebody who was simply hired by the government.
Talk a little bit about how the American surveillance state actually functions. Does it target the actions of Americans?
NSA and the intelligence community in general is focused on getting intelligence wherever it can, by any means possible, that it believes on the grounds of sort of a self-certification that they serve the national interest. Originally, we saw that focus very narrowly tailored as foreign intelligence gathered overseas. Now, increasingly, we see that it's happening domestically. And to do that, the NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default. It collects them in its system, and it filters them, and it analyzes them, and it measures them, and it stores them for periods of time, simply because that's the easiest, most efficient, and most valuable way to achieve these ends. So while they may be intending to target someone associated with a foreign government or someone that they suspect of terrorism, they're collecting your communications to do so. Any analyst at any time can target anyone, any selector anywhere. Where those communications will be picked up depends on the range of the sensor networks and the authorities that that analyst is empowered with. Not all analysts have the ability to target everything.
There's probably no other event in history that affected my personal views on politics and the affairs of government more than the Snowden revelations. Though I have always been somewhat skeptical of power and of official narratives for as long as I can remember, I was certainly no revolutionary anarchist. And in 2013, when the story broke, I still held many naive and conventional opinions in regards to the state. I believed that, though the government got it wrong a lot, sure, they weren't malicious. They didn't intentionally hurt people, and when they did, it was more by accident than by ill will. I repeated the all too common cliche of Hanlon's razor, and I allowed peer pressure and the way people spoke about the government to color my perceptions. But a nerdy systems analyst, only 5 years my senior, completely disabused me of these notions. When Snowden exposed to the world the vast, sophisticated, and deliberate spying apparatus that was intended not to catch bad guys, which even when they did was incidental at best, but was instead designed to monitor the communications of everyone, everywhere, and at any time. It put on display how the sausage was actually made. That these three-letter agencies aren't just public servants filled with upstanding citizens, but are in fact parasites, which feed on the organism of the state. One could say it's more House of Cards than the West Wing. For many of us, we grew up in a milieu where we aren't encouraged to think deeply about the criminal behavior of these institutions. In fact, even using the word criminal to describe how these spying entities behave turns many people off, despite being perhaps the most accurate description. See, we refuse to just apply the same set of ethical standards to, say, the CIA or the FBI that we would to a multinational corporation or the mafia. To take the comparison a step further, most people hold their own children more accountable than they do the NSA. The entire culture around these organizations has completely detached us from any semblance of justice or law. The cognitive dissonance is so ingrained and so hopelessly enmeshed into our collective psyche, it would perhaps take a miracle to snap us out of it. But for a moment, however brief, snapping us out of it was exactly what Snowden did. On June 6, 2013, journalist and former lawyer Glenn Greenwald published an article on The Guardian entitled NSA Collecting Phone Records of Millions of Verizon Customers Daily, which would be the beginning of a series of articles detailing a vast network of unconstitutional surveillance programs against virtually every U.S. citizen and of non-citizens around the world. In the piece, Greenwald lays out, based on documents given him by one Ed Snowden, the NSA had in fact forced Verizon to collect, store, and share every single bit of available data from the users of the network. Not only that, through a thing called the FISA court, Verizon was under strict orders not to share the fact that they were doing this data collection and sharing it with the government. The government also took painstaking steps to ensure that the public and even their own NATO allies were unaware of their activities. The old adage, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, apparently only works in one direction. The whole NSA scandal brought the term metadata into the public consciousness, because the government was technically not allowed to actually eavesdrop on phone conversations or internet activity of American citizens without a warrant. They found a loophole that could get them the same results. In fact, in many ways, they were better results. By collecting all of the tertiary information of any given individual, like geolocation, duration of phone calls, destination of phone calls, frequency of calls, and so forth, an NSA agent could create an entire profile of a person. They could detect patterns of behavior and even predict future actions. The bulk data collection would give one insight into all sorts of personal details about people, like what they ate, where they worked, who they spent time with, and even their sexual habits, all without ever having to listen to a spoken word or reading a text from their subjects. By creating a backdoor to the internet and phone companies, through coercion I might add, they are able to spy on everyone at any time and for any reason. How was the government able to strong-arm businesses like Verizon into granting them access to backdoors? Well, a little thing called the FISA court.
It is one of the most secretive places in America, a federal court of 11 judges with the power to allow government to conduct electronic surveillance on you. Its work unseen by the public for decades until this classified order revealed last month by self-confessed NSA leaker Edward Snowden. It shows the mission of the intelligence community has morphed, giving them more data collecting authority, all with the blessing of this court.
The laws have been secretly interpreted in a way that now allows the government to monitor the communications of all of us. There's a dragnet of surveillance now in place. It appears to be acting as a rubber stamp.
The judges rotate, serving 1 week at a time, appointed exclusively by this man, Chief Justice John Roberts, who at his confirmation hearing expressed initial reservations to the idea.
It's not what we usually think of when we think of a court. We think of a place where we can go, we can watch, the lawyers argue, and it's subject to the glare of publicity.
But the Federal Intelligence Surveillance Court is anything but public. It's here somewhere inside this sprawling federal court complex off of Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C.
In order to fully understand the FISA court and why it exists, we need to go back a few years. Like many departments inside of the intelligence community, the precursor to the NSA actually began in the military as the Armed Forces Security Agency and was formed just after the United States entered the European theater during World War I in 1917. In its initial conception, it was supposed to be a spy agency that was intended to intercept communications from foreign enemies for the war effort. They specialized in decryption and telecommunications. But like any good temporary program, it became a permanent office in Washington, D.C. As the years passed, the department's methods became more sophisticated and far-reaching, doing much more than simply intercepting the communications of America's enemies. By August of 1945, less than a month before the end of World War II, the AFSA began two top-secret spying programs called Project Minaret and Project Shamrock. And if you thought these projects were created to help the US defeat the Nazis and Imperial Japan, you would be quite mistaken. In fact, by this time, the war was pretty much over. Germany had given an unconditional surrender months earlier, and the first atomic bomb was already dropped on Hiroshima. Minaret and Shamrock were not for America's enemies, but for its citizens. The way the programs worked was by intercepting virtually every telegram communication sent into and out of the country. They were able to backdoor into various telecommunication companies like Western Union and ITT. Some of these companies objected over concerns of the legality of the program, but ultimately complied with the government under assurances from politicians like the Attorney General Tom Clark that no one would be prosecuted or sued. At one point during the Project Shamrock operations, the government was analyzing around 150,000 documents per month, all without modern computer power or algorithmic assistance, mind you. The information they were collecting was not under any suspicion of illicit activities of any particular citizen. It was just a dragnet to collect as much data as humanly possible. The companies which were assisting the AFSA kept everything a secret and never disclosed to anyone their clearly illegal activities. That was until 1975, when Idaho Senator Frank Church opened up the Church Committee hearings, which would ultimately expose a plethora of crimes committed by a myriad of intelligence agencies through subpoenas and testimonies under oath. Among some of the most scandalous revelations was the CIA's MKUltra program, which was experimenting in trauma-based mind control, often drugging and torturing completely innocent American citizens without consent in an effort to scientifically understand how to psychologically manipulate and control people. All kinds of abuses, ranging from assassination plots to spying on civil rights organizations, were put on display for the public record during the hearings, and among these disclosures was that of Project Shamrock. By the early 1950s, the AFSA was split off from the military and turned into what we now know as the National Security Agency. And as we can see, their habit, let's call it, was always to engage in perpetual domestic spying and data collection. In fact, the Snowden revelations of their abuse of power was not anything new. It was perpetual, systematic, and expressly designed for such purposes. The NSA has a pattern of behavior that goes back decades and has stretched so far beyond the scope of what any rational person could consider constitutional or legal. They would more accurately be described as an enemy of the state had they been associated with a foreign government. So, by the time the church committees began in earnest, the NSA had already built a storied history of violating the rights of American citizens, and their reputation was dragged through the mud for it. In fact, Senator Church said of Project Shamrock, quote, "It's probably the largest government interception program affecting Americans ever undertaken," end quote. The ensuing fallout from the hearings would be that the NSA director at the time, Lou Allen, would almost immediately suspend both Minaret and Shamrock. But not because he believed it was wrong, but because he got caught. Another unfortunate consequence of the hearings was the creation of the FISA courts, which were intended to create more safeguards and accountability to intel agencies who were abusing their power. But ultimately, it had the opposite effect. FISA is an acronym for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a piece of legislation forged in the Church Committee to act as a bulwark against domestic spying. Essentially, it regulates what, how much, and whom intelligence agencies are allowed to collect data on. In order to enforce compliance, FISA established a court, or panel of judges, who would have to review every request to engage in spying and either approve or deny it. The only problem is that because of the supposed national security interests involved in these courts, all of the applications were completely obscured from the public and the vast majority of elected representatives. All decisions and opinions from judges were top secret. So, right from the beginning, the project was obviously not going to have the intended effect. According to Glenn Greenwald and the documents he obtained from Edward Snowden, from 1978 until 2012, the FISA court rejected a grand total of 11 government applications and approved over 20,000. Clearly, what the court actually does is serve as a rubber stamp for virtually any surveillance action the government wants to take. It gives the appearance of legitimacy while exhibiting none of the transparency that would be required to make it legitimate. In fact, the process of the FISA court follows none of the principles that a traditional judicial system is predicated on. Things like innocence until proven guilty, probable cause, or the right to be judged by a jury of your peers are all afterthoughts to the FISA court. Instead, what you get is an opaque hearing obscured by mountains of red tape and classification for alleged national security. By the time 2001 rolled around, the war on terror began in earnest. By the end of that year, President George W. Bush was about to eliminate any illusion of due process through these kangaroo courts. Bush had signed executive orders to give the NSA the ability to spy, surveil, and do any type of data collection they felt necessary without approval from a FISA court, literally stating that the process was, and I quote, too cumbersome. Eventually, however, by the late 2005, the New York Times had released articles detailing how the NSA had grossly overstepped its authority and was engaging in warrantless surveillance on a mass scale. The response to this by the administration was to draw up legislation called the FISA Amendments Act of 2008, which essentially guaranteed the NSA was able to retain its power to not be required to submit applications to the FISA court, except in the narrowest of circumstances. Barack Obama, who campaigned in 2008 on a platform of transparency and reining in the intelligence agencies, renewed the Amendments Act every time it came up during his presidency. One requirement of the FISA Amendments Act was that the NSA report to Congress exactly how many eavesdropping applications it made, as well as how many were rejected and accepted. In the calendar year of 2012, all 1,789 of the applications were accepted, with 0 rejections.
You've got this network of sensors around the world, and then I, sitting at the NSA in Hawaii, come in the morning, I type in my search. I look for, let's say I want to read John Key's email. I enter his email address, and it sends that search to every one of these sensor networks around the world. And they search their local database of metadata and content. The content of all communications that pass through these sites is held for about 3 to 5 days, depending on the storage, and it's constantly going back further and further in time as we gain more capability. So I can see everything. I can see what book you looked at Amazon.com, last week. I can see who you talked to. I can see who your friends on Facebook are. I can see the text messages you sent. I can read the emails you wrote. And I can set up things that are called fingerprints that allow me to track where you've been on the web, who you're talking to, even if you're using sort of anonymizing technology and so forth. Now, what's interesting about these sensor networks is when I'm typing in this search for an email address, I say where in the world, which of these sensors I want it to go to. And I know that there's mass surveillance happening in New Zealand because one of those checkboxes, one of those sensor networks, is in New Zealand.
The tool that is most utilized by intel agencies around the world, including the NSA, for spying domestically and abroad, is the highly secretive software called X-Keyscore. It is difficult to explain the vast capabilities and actual scope of this program. simply because no computer engineers or journalists have ever been allowed to open it up and examine it with a fine-tooth comb to make for public availability. The only reason we know about it at all is because of Snowden's whistleblowing, wherein he blew the lid open on how the sausage was made, so to speak. What we do know of Xkeyscore is that it is in large part a collection and cataloging tool, which provides a centralized database for those with access to the software to run queries through in order to access information that has been collected on any number of individuals. As Snowden himself explains, quote, "You could read anyone's email in the world. Anybody you've got an email address for. Any website. You can watch traffic to and from it. Any computer that an individual sits at, you can watch it. Any laptop that you're tracking, you can follow it as it moves from place to place throughout the world. It's a one-stop shop for access to the NSA's information. You can tag individuals. Let's say you work at a major German corporation, and I want to access to that network. I can track your username on a website, on a forum somewhere. I can track your real name. I can track associates with your friends, and I can build what's called a fingerprint, which is network activity unique to you, which means anywhere you go in the world, anywhere you try to sort of hide your online presence, your identity." End quote. Xkeyscore is like the Google for spy agencies. Except it doesn't give you facts about the year your favorite musician was born or where to go out for dinner. It gives you the personal information of anyone on the internet. Information that they may not make publicly available by choice. Now, the Google analogy is a little oversimplistic. The software itself is incredibly complex and not exactly user-friendly. According to Snowden and others who have used it, you actually have to be trained extensively in order to use it properly. In fact, it is such a skill that journalists have found people who work in the intelligence industry actually placing on their resume that they are proficient in Xkeyscore. And it was only until recently that we now understand how truly chilling it is that intelligence employees would be openly advertising how good they are at snooping into the lives of citizens who have never been suspected of committing a crime. Now, unlike the metadata that the NSA has been collecting for decades, wherein they create character profiles of as many people as they possibly can, Xkeyscore works a little bit differently in that you can actually listen through the microphones on your devices or look through the cameras on a device without the user being aware. And more disturbingly, even while the device is powered off, it is possible to access it. This software gives one the ability to comb through emails and search histories, access and download files, and give up GPS locations. The program can give the user full and unfettered access to any of your devices, and they have methods of breaking into them when they're disconnected from the internet. Their capabilities to surveil you, steal your data, infect your phone or computer with viruses and malware are virtually limitless, and the average person has no defense against these kind of attacks. Even the more sophisticated and computer-savvy individuals have a difficult time repelling the intrusions simply because of the sheer vastness and relentless dragnets the intelligence agencies cast. The only way to avoid being watched 24/7 by governments, both domestic and abroad, is to completely disconnect from modern technology and the internet entirely, which is an increasingly difficult task in our ever more tech-reliant world. Not only that, Soon there will be almost no employers you can work for who won't require you to use a device that is connected to the internet in one way or another. It's also not just American intelligence which has access to X-Keyscore either. All of the Five Eyes countries do, and presumably they abuse it. That includes Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. They also have the capabilities to not only spy on and invade devices within their respective countries, but anywhere abroad as well. And to add insult to injury, in 2014, even after the Snowden revelations, the NSA went ahead and built a massive server farm in the Utah desert in order to compile and store an extraordinary amount of information, which is on the order of exabytes. The organization has never publicly disclosed what the exact purpose of these facilities are, but presumably the only probable reason for it would be bulk data collection. Indeed, Snowden, in his memoir titled Permanent Record, writes at length about how bulk collection works and that the NSA has an explicit philosophy to collect as much data on as many people as possible, even those under no suspicion of wrongdoing. Much of this data they collect will never actually be reviewed by human eyes, but they want it so that they can retroactively return to the archives for whatever they need at any time. Using programs like X-Keyscore helps them to do this with relative ease, and as Snowden has claimed, has been abused by staff with access to the software to do all sorts of criminal activity like spying on their ex-spouses and watching a woman they like undress in front of her computer without her wherewithal.
Architecture, even if the best people in the world are in control of it, it tracks assholes.
Yeah.
And those assholes do things with that power that the original designers would not do. No matter where we look, we can see, especially with financial systems, that effectively, even if the people have the best of intentions, it doesn't matter. I mean, the architecture is the truth. It's true for the internet with regard to communications. The so-called lawful intercept systems, which is just a nice way of saying spying on people, right? That stuff was built, I think.
Well, that's a euphemism, lawful interception.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
like lawful murder. You've heard about that. The drone
torture.
strikes on American citizens by the U.S. President Obama. You know, when he killed Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son in Yemen, that's lawful murder, right? Or targeted killing, as they put it, right? So so-called lawful intercept is the same thing. You just put lawful in front of everything, and then all of a sudden, because the state does it, it's legitimate. But it's, in fact, the architecture of the state that allows them to do that at all. And it is the architecture of the laws and the architecture of the technology just as the same as it's the architecture of financial systems. And what the cypherpunks wanted to do was to create systems where we could compensate each other in a truly free way, where it was not possible to.
Microsoft, Google, Apple, Skype, Facebook, YouTube, AOL, Yahoo, and Verizon. What do all of these companies have in common? They all knowingly and mostly voluntarily gave the government access to their servers in order to conduct bulk data collection of their customers without their customers' consent or knowledge. The program that was used is called PRISM. PRISM is the backbone of the mass surveillance, in that it piggybacks off of the internal servers of the participating companies, giving the NSA the ability to access emails, text chats, videos, voice calls, recordings, photos, files, social media accounts, and login information. And this isn't just me saying this, it's openly stated on a number of the NSA slides that Snowden leaked to Glenn Greenwald. PRISM also shows us that the government would not be able to be nearly as successful as they were without the help of the private sector. If ever there was a match made in hell, it would be the so-called private-public partnership. Commercial innovation fused with government coercion is a recipe for a dystopian nightmare. It is hard to say, though, how readily these companies gave the NSA this type of access. We may never know if there were warnings from the NSA to these companies that if they didn't cooperate, they would be slammed with massive fines and have the SEC weaponized against them by bogging them down in faux antitrust lawsuits for years. Things like that have happened before. It could also be that they were bribed in some way with promises of tax incentives, regulatory relief, or even the disclosure of competitor trade secrets. Whatever the case may be, it is obvious that the tech giants were the ones to whom we all gave the proverbial key to our digital home, which the NSA exploited. For the most part, if there ever was resistance and pushback from the companies involved in PRISM, we would not likely ever know about it, except in the case of Verizon. According to a leak to the Washington Post in April of 2014, it was revealed that Verizon had, quote, filed a legal challenge to the constitutionality of the National Security Agency's program that collects billions of Americans' call detail records, end quote. This legal challenge, however, was submitted to the FISA court, and not a typical appeals court, helping it evade standard jurisprudence. This ultimately led to it to be rejected by the judge in favor of the NSA's actions. And as we have seen, the bias of this particular court skews strongly in favor of the government. Though Verizon's spokespeople would neither confirm nor deny this secret legal action, it would suggest that there was clearly a level of coercion being applied to at least some of these companies, pressuring them to participate in PRISM. In fact, only weeks prior to the Verizon case against the spying, U.S. District Judge Richard Leon had granted an injunction against the NSA collecting records on a man by the name of Larry Klayman, who was suing them for unwarranted surveillance. In the judge's statements on the case, he said that the collection of phone records was, quote, almost certainly unconstitutional. In his 68-page ruling, he elaborated further, saying, quote, I cannot imagine a more indiscriminate and arbitrary invasion than this systematic and high-tech collection and retention of personal data on virtually every single citizen for purposes of querying and analyzing it without prior judicial approval. Surely, such a program infringes on that degree of privacy that the founders enshrined in the Fourth Amendment. End quote. It is rather illuminating how vastly different the opinion of this judge is to that of the judges who sit on the clandestine FISA courts, without the watchful eye of the public and the immunity of national security interests. Now, we can only speculate here, as many have, that this case triggered Verizon to file their own legal action, if nothing else to wash their own hands should their participation in PRISM ever be exposed. The history of the program is no less sordid either. Immediately after the September 11th attacks, then President Bush instituted what was called the, quote, terrorist surveillance program. And yeah, it was exactly how it sounds. However, this predecessor to PRISM pretty quickly got shut down because of the backlash, both legal and political, because of the program's ability to spy on people without a warrant. PRISM came later under the 2007 Protect America Act, which required that it must obtain warrants from the FISA courts to give the veneer of legitimacy. As we have learned from the Snowden leaks, warrants did not stop PRISM from committing vast and comprehensive violations of privacy rights. It was also clear that many NSA staff, even the low-level ones, were regularly committing felonies by accessing the data in PRISM without a warrant, and often for personal reasons. And even when warrants were applied for, they needed very little justification and received almost no scrutiny. The normal reactions to all this should be that these miscarriages of justice must be addressed, that when they get caught, redresses must be made. But no, quite the opposite, in fact. Just months prior to the Snowden revelations, James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, was asked during a congressional hearing if the NSA engaged in spying.
So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
He denied the allegation, which was a lie. It is also a felony to lie under oath to Congress, a crime which can lead to up to 5 years in prison. To this day, no prosecutor has brought a case against Clapper. Obama and several prominent Democrats even acknowledged his less than honest response, but simply hand-waved it away. Lying to Congress under oath has actually thrown a handful of people in jail for even less brazen mistruth than that of Jim Clapper. But the powerful and well-connected are above the law. For them, there is no such thing as a rules-based international order. It is pure law of the jungle, might makes right, with the window dressings of democracy and legitimacy. And it wasn't just the NSA lying. It was politicians and career bureaucrats lying for and about the NSA.
Let me ask you first of all about news of the day, the National Security Administration. People wonder, how is it you didn't know about the cell phones being looked at or listened to, and why you didn't know and who should have told you?
Well, first of all, I'm not confirming a bunch of assumptions that have been made in the press. But what I have said is that the national security operations generally have one purpose, and that is to make sure that the American people are safe and that I'm making good decisions, and I'm the final user of all the intelligence that they gather. But they're involved in a whole wide range of issues, and we give them policy direction. But what we've seen over the last several years is that
all this news that the U.S. Conducted surveillance on our own allies. Some of the documents posted by or leaked by Edward Snowden to the media indicate that these programs started in 2002. Why spy on an ally?
Jake, if there were such a program, it'd be classified and I couldn't talk about it. It'd be totally inappropriate. And I haven't been in the loop now, obviously, for more than 4 years. So it's just one of those subjects I couldn't discuss.
Without getting specific, on a theoretical basis, what is the interest of the United States in conducting surveillance on a country or a leader who is a clear ally of the United States?
I've got to go with the answer I've given you. Let me say this: we do have a fantastic intelligence capability worldwide against all kinds of potential issues and concerns. We are vulnerable, as was shown on 9/11, and you never know. Senator Feinstein, we know and we have learned a lot about the capabilities of the U.S. government. Have you at this point come to any conclusion about whether those capabilities and that power was abused by these agencies?
No, I have seen no abuse by these agencies, nor has any claim ever been made in any way, shape, or form that this was abused. You know, it's interesting to me because, I've been going to China for 34 years now, trying to increase relationships.
So here I have my Verizon phone, my cell phone. What authorized investigation gave you the grounds for acquiring my cell phone data?
I want to make sure I get this exactly right. I think on the legal standards and stuff, on this part here, I think we need to get Department of Justice and others, because it is a complex area. And you're asking a specific question. I don't want to shirk that, but I want to make sure I get it exactly right. And so I do think what we should do as part of perhaps the closed hearing tomorrow, walk through that with the intent of taking what you've asked and seeing if we can get it declassified and out to the American people so they see exactly how we do it. Because
I saw an interview in which Mr. Snowden claimed that due to his position at NSA, he could tap into virtually any American's phone calls or emails. True or false?
False. I know of no way to do that.
Thank you.
The man in the last clip, one General Keith Alexander, was the appointed head of the NSA from 2005 to 2014. Coming to power during the height of the Cold War, he was perhaps the most ambitious leader of the organization to date. He presided over the development of PRISM and X-Keyscore. He also advised on a number of policy agendas to help insulate the NSA from transparency and accountability. The wider public is not very familiar with Keith Alexander, but they should be. Of all the criminal elements involved in spying on innocent civilians, he is perhaps the least known, but most important. When we think of mass surveillance, often Edward Snowden, Obama, James Clapper all come to mind, but they pale in comparison to the role that Alexander himself played in a culture of corruption at one of the world's largest spy agencies. To really explain the mentality that Alexander brought into the agency, the Washington Post's 2013 profile on him sheds some light. Quote, "At the time, more than 100 teams of U.S. analysts were scouring Iraq for snippets of electronic data that might lead to the bomb makers and their hidden factories. But the NSA director, General Keith B. Alexander, wanted more than mere snippets. He wanted everything. Every Iraqi text message, phone call, and email that could be vacuumed up by the agency's powerful computers. Rather than look for a single needle in the haystack, his approach was, let's collect the whole haystack, said one former senior U.S. intelligence official who tracked the plan's implementation. Collect it all, tag it, store it, and whatever it is you want, go searching for it. It also encapsulated Alexander's controversial approach to safeguarding Americans from what he sees as a host of imminent threats, from terrorism to devastating cyber attacks. In his 8 years at the helm of the country's electronic surveillance agency, Alexander, 61, has quietly presided over a revolution in the government's ability to scoop up information in the name of national security. And as he did in Iraq, Alexander has pushed hard for everything he can get: tools, resources, and legal authority to collect and store vast quantities of raw information on American and foreign communications. End quote. Keith Alexander was not completely unlike a man we talked about at the beginning of this episode, one Jeremy Bentham. Like Bentham, he is a utilitarian, in that he believes that the ends justifies the means. And like Bentham, he views himself in an almost deified light, that he alone holds the keys to the security of the society, that only he is willing to do what it takes, and only he can keep you safe. In another eerie parallel, they both attempted to build a panopticon, one physical and one digital. The difference, however, where Bentham had failed to see his vision come to pass, Alexander was successful in implementing the most far-reaching, vast, and comprehensive surveillance program, which was so total, so complete, and watching all of us all the time, it would make George Orwell blush. Will Alexander or his accomplices ever be held accountable for their crimes, like lying to Congress or spying on innocent civilians without a warrant? Apparently not. In fact, he was appointed to the board of Amazon in September of 2020, a company which, as it happens, manufactures and sells all sorts of smart home devices, like Alexa, which have the capability to collect and store vast troves of data never thought possible. He was giving this appointment despite, at the time, running a pump and dump scam with his private cybersecurity company called IronNet, publishing fraudulent company data in order to artificially inflate the stock price. He was eventually pushed out of IronNet in 2023, but has yet to be indicted by the SEC for securities fraud as of this recording. Amazon still has him listed on their board. Despite all of these revelations and the exposure of criminal behavior, mass surveillance has gotten far worse since Snowden's initial disclosures. Spyware like Pegasus, developed by an Israeli security firm, is ubiquitous and on almost everybody's mobile device, even if you don't know it. It has been used to spy on opposition parties in numerous states and has been exploited against political dissidents. China, among other states, has implemented surveillance on an industrial scale against its own citizens. The Chinese have a penchant for stealing ideas from American innovation, and mass surveillance is no exception. During the COVID-19 pandemic, almost every state across the planet sent their snooping capabilities into overdrive and allowed their spy agencies to be unleashed onto the populace in truly stunning ways. In the Twitter files, journalist Matt Taibbi exposed how the FBI and CIA had been using the social media company to monitor accounts that specifically dissented from the establishment consensus on COVID-19. He also further demonstrated how they pressured the company to intentionally throttle these contrarian views so that they could not be viewed by as many people. Most countries developed phone apps that would have your vaccination status and other information related to the pandemic. In Australia, its intel agencies were caught almost right away collecting the data on these apps without a warrant or probable cause of any wrongdoing. These agencies excused their behavior, citing that the collection was quote-unquote incidental. Of course, if I incidentally collected data on the government that they don't want me to have, with no intention of turning it over, I would be placed in a supermax prison for years. We are coming into an age where state voyeurism will know absolutely no limits. And they will do it with a particular kind of arrogance, not just believing it to be some kind of necessary evil, but in many cases gloating about it, arrogantly boasting about their capabilities to watch us, manipulate us, and distort our perceptions through information warfare. As is often the case with those who possess the ring of power, it is a poisonous force that gives one delusions of grandeur. That, like a god, they must hear all, know all, and see all with their ever watchful eye.